site of the first ever meeting of the UN General Assembly, which took place exactly 75 years ago today, and a lot has happened since then. This event is being hosted by the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, the UN 75th Anniversary Team and Project Everyone to mark that important event, as well as the agreement 5 years ago of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. But what we're really going to talk about today is what's happening right now and what lies ahead. COVID-19 has made it painfully clear that the challenges we face are global, whether that's pandemics or climate change. Last year was devastating for so many reasons, and as we enter 2021, we are still in the thick of fighting the pandemic and many other threats. But we also know that amazing things are possible, as 2020 clearly showed us. The development of vaccines in record time, cuts to carbon emissions, and communities coming together to help each other. When we work together across borders and generations, we can overcome challenges and build a better future. Shortly, I'll be speaking to António Guterres, who is Secretary General of the United Nations, about how we can go about this. And I'll also be hearing from some amazing young activists. But first, we are going to hear from the current President of the United Nations General Assembly, Mr. Volkan Bozkır, in a special message from New York.
Excellencies, I'm delighted to address this commemoration of the General Assembly's first meeting that took place in this very hall 75 years ago today. Since that initial meeting, the General Assembly has met in 75 sessions to discuss and act on the topics that matter most to our people.
Lord Ahmed, please stand by.
It has grown from 51 members to 193 today. But it still remains a shining example of multilateralism, where every country, no matter how big or small, gets one equal vote. And it remains a sanctuary where nations can peacefully address their differences and find solutions to global challenges. As we recover from COVID-19 and move together towards a greener, more equitable world, we will continue to be guided and inspired by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Sustainable Development Goals. Over the past 75 years, we have achieved more together than we could have apart. As we move into the next 75 years and our world becomes ever more connected, let us tighten those bonds so we can best protect and deliver for the peoples we serve. Thank you.
Lord Ahmed, please unmute. Get ready.
Thank you to Mr. Volkan Bozkır for that message. It's amazing to think just how much history has been made through the United Nations. The UK played a key role in the founding of the UN after the devastation of the Second World War. And I'm really pleased now to invite the host of today's event, Lord Ahmed, Minister of State at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, to say a few words.
Well, Tina, thank you. It's a real pleasure to join everyone at this event, albeit virtually, but may I...
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, you're live.
Well, thank you very much, Tina. I am truly delighted to join this, albeit virtual event today. Friends and colleagues, Your Excellency, Secretary General Guterres, I'm delighted to join you all as we mark the anniversary of the very first United Nations General Assembly. 75 years ago today, representatives from 51 countries met at Westminster Central Hall in London. After the ravages of 2 world wars, their ambitious goal was a global coalition that would rebuild and grow stronger together. A personal inspiration of mine, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi ji, had earlier said, and I quote, that our ability to reach unity in diversity will be the beauty and test of our civilization. Both he and our founding members were absolutely right. In the years since, as our numbers within the United Nations have grown, so has the scale of global challenges, and so have our achievements as we stand together, come together, work together to face them. Whether it's feeding the hungry, to strengthening human rights across the world, whether it's negotiating peace, resolving conflict, supporting reconstruction, the United Nations can be proud of the way it has made a difference to so many people's lives across the world. The United Kingdom is equally proud to have played its part, both as one of the UN's founding members and as a permanent member of the Security Council. We have consistently been one of the UN's largest donors, supporting its important work across the world. We have collaborated to champion human rights, champion and strengthen democracy, and the urgency in the here and now of tackling climate change. Over the years, thousands of UK nationals have worked directly for the United Nations organization, one of whom, Sir Brian Urquhart, recently passed away. He was present here in London when the UN General Assembly first met, and spent the next 4 decades as one of the organization's most visionary leaders. He nurtured the development of UN peacekeeping, and we all collectively pay tribute to his services. Meanwhile, it was another British official, Dame Margaret Anstey, who became the first woman to head a UN operation. And I know how much the Secretary General puts on the importance of ensuring every person, irrespective of who they are, where they are, plays their part. Reflecting back to my mentor, the incredible Gandhiji, he also said, to be real, unity must stand the fiercest, severest strain without breaking. And I think that 2020, as we reflect back on that year, truly qualifies for that role. Nevertheless, the unity we have seen over this incredibly challenging year, be it on aid, on healthcare, on collaboration, on vaccines, has been something wonderful to behold. I fully accept there is so much still to do, but it's the coming together, collaborating and cooperating as we are, we will help overcome these new and terrible challenges. COVID-19, of course, is only one of the many battles. Many of you I know are responding directly to the Secretary General's global conversation, expressed your concern about the damage that climate change is inflicting on our environment and indeed on our security. We all need to find new ways of doing things. So our progress is not the expense of our planet, but it's by working together. The UK is ready to co-host COP26 later this year.
Thank you very much, Lord Ahmad. We seem to be having some technical problems there. But before I get my chance to go to the next part of today's event, which is interviewing the Secretary General, we are going to hear from him in his first major speech of 2021. So I'm very pleased to introduce the United Nations Secretary General and a short film about what the United Nations did to mark its 75th anniversary during the turbulent year that was 2020.
Our world is facing unprecedented challenges. Climate change is altering natural balance. And our precious wildlife is struggling to survive. We are battling a new era of conflict and violence. There's the disruptive impact from digital technologies and shifting demographics with gaping inequalities. Now, a global epidemic is reshaping our world as we know it. We are at a crossroad at a time when our world seems so divided. Our world is struggling to breathe. For the United Nations 75th anniversary, we set out to ask the world, what are your hopes for your future?
If you could choose one thing to say to the UN, to world leaders about the future, what would that be?
In January 2020, the United Nations launched a global initiative to have the world's largest conversation on the future we want. Discussions have taken place in all settings, from classrooms to boardrooms, parliaments to village halls across the world, in order to reach as many people as possible. The United Nations listened, and the world spoke.
Justice, equality, and freedom for all.
People can really be in peace and with dignity, because our dignity was taken away from us because of our religion and because of who we are. And I hope that we are the last community who are suffering of those problems.
Health is often looked at as an expense. It is not. It is an investment.
We change by exchanging without losing ourselves.
We have run out of excuses and we are running out of time.
If we don't stop the destruction of our natural world, nothing else will matter.
More than ever before, we need solidarity, hope, and the political will to see this crisis through together.
From what we have heard, the world is not as divided as we thought. The global economy, healthcare, sanitation, education, and the hardest places hit are our top priorities from recovering from the pandemic. In response to COVID-19, greater international solidarity is urgently needed. The threat of climate change and destruction of our natural environment is the biggest fear for the future. We need increased efforts to reduce conflict and violence, and we aspire to further protect human rights. For optimism about our future, we need to look to our young people. The overwhelming majority of us believe global cooperation is more vital than ever.
Every time we fail to find solutions to global challenges, the most vulnerable people in our societies are hit the hardest.
Throughout history, we have accomplished unimaginable things, propelling each generation further than the last. There is no limit to the amount of good we can achieve together to make this world, our world, a better place. The challenges before us are universal, and we know that these challenges demand global solutions. We have the blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all, the Sustainable Development Goals. In 2045, the United Nations 100th year, let's see the change we have implemented today that will shine a light on our children's tomorrow.
Change is coming. The real power belongs to the people.
And I want to turn the question inside out as well. I will not ask, how dare you? Instead, I will ask, do you dare to?
This is the most urgent of times and the most urgent of messages. Now must be our moment for action.
Stand by, Secretary General. 4, 3, 2, 1, Secretary Live.
Lord Ahmad, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear young people. It is a special privilege to address you today on the 75th anniversary of the first meeting of the General Assembly of the United Nations, which took place in London. First of all, let me say how deeply I regret not to be physically present with you to commemorate this historic event. And I want to express my total solidarity with the British people in these challenging times of the pandemic, my sincere condolences to the families of those who have perished, and my admiration for the courage and sacrifice of the health workers and others on the front lines, rescuing people at the risk of their own lives. Dear friends, I want to pay tribute to one of the organizers of the first meeting of the General Assembly, the legendary Sir Brian Urquhart, who passed away last week. Sir Brian's combination of dedication, integrity, and diplomatic skill set the standard for the United Nations. He left a lasting mark on many areas of our work, particularly the establishment of United Nations peacekeeping missions that have saved countless lives and reduced human suffering around the world. Sir Brian will be remembered with pride as we continue our pursuit of the goal he cherished throughout his career, a peaceful and just world. Distinguished guests and dear young people, the United Nations was founded in 1945 in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. But its origins lie in the darkest hours of that conflict. In August 1941, as unprecedented suffering spread across the globe and Jews across Europe faced extermination, as London was being bombed and Parliament itself was hit, Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Franklin D. Roosevelt came together to commit to a unique vision for post-war generations. The commitments they made, known as the Atlantic Charter, set the foundations for a just world order based on the right of all people to choose their own form of government and on cooperation, human rights, and rule of law. 3 years later, in 1945, many of the principles and values of the Atlantic Charter were enshrined in our founding document, the United Nations Charter. In many ways, the vision of our founders has been vindicated. There has not been a third world war. Since 1945, the world has enjoyed the longest period in recorded history without a military confrontation between major powers. That in itself is a great achievement of which the United Nations and its member states can be rightly proud. The General Assembly, where states have gathered for 75 years to debate the most important issues of our age, has seen many historic moments. And its daily work has played an enormous part in formulating and upholding laws on key global goods, from human rights and environmental protection to arms control and war crimes. The work of the General Assembly has helped to boost global health, literacy, and living standards, and to promote human rights and gender equality. The General Assembly's declaration on the granting of independence to colonial peoples in 1960 was a milestone for self-determination. Since the UN was established, more than 80 former colonies have gained their independence. In the past year, the United Nations has been on the front lines of the COVID-19 pandemic. The World Health Organization has led the global health response and coordinated the provision of essential equipment, training, and services worldwide. Early in the pandemic, the General Assembly acted swiftly to pass a resolution calling for global solidarity to fight the virus. Distinguished guests and dear friends, while we are proud of our collective achievements, we are also aware of our failures. The climate emergency is already upon us, and the global response has been utterly inadequate. The past decade was the hottest in human history. Carbon dioxide levels are at record highs. Apocalyptic fires and floods, cyclones and hurricanes are becoming the new normal. If we don't change course, we may be headed for a catastrophic temperature rise of more than 3 degrees this century. Biodiversity is collapsing. 1 million species are at risk of extinction, and whole ecosystems are disappearing before our eyes. This is a war on nature and a war with no winners. Meanwhile, conventional wars are growing more entrenched and difficult to resolve, and geopolitical tensions are escalating. The threat of nuclear proliferation and confrontation has returned. Inequality is growing. Hunger is on the rise. The number of people who have fallen into extreme poverty has increased for the first time in decades. Transformative technology has opened up vast new opportunities, but also new threats, from cyber warfare to rampant disinformation, from hate speech to political subversion and mass surveillance. And the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted serious gaps in global cooperation and solidarity. We have seen this most recently in vaccine nationalism, as some rich countries compete to buy vaccines for their own people with no consideration for the world's poor. And I thank the government and people of the United Kingdom for supporting the COVAX facility established by the World Health Organization to guarantee that vaccines will be available to all as a global public good. Distinguished guests and dear friends, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a disproportionate and terrible impact on the poor and dispossessed, older people and children, those with disabilities and minorities of all kinds. It has pushed an estimated 88 million people into poverty and put more than 270 million at risk of acute food insecurity. Disruption to education will affect millions of children for their entire lives, and millions of women have been trapped at home with their abusers, and progress on gender equality has been reversed. Emergency measures have been invoked to quash dissent and silence the media. The pandemic has revealed the deep fragilities in our world. And to tackle these fragilities, we need to reduce inequality and injustice, and to strengthen the bonds of mutual support and trust. At the international level, I have called for a new global deal. Power and resources and opportunities must be managed better and shared more equitably. Developing countries must have a proportionate role, more relevant in global institutions. At the national level, I've called for a new social contract between people, governments, the private sector, civil society, and more, to tackle the roots of inequality with fair taxation on income and wealth, universal benefits, and opportunities for all. We need a strong emphasis on quality education for all, not forgetting girls, and on access to digital technology as powerful equalizers and enablers. Investment in the recovery must put economies and societies on stronger foundations: human rights and dignity, peaceful cooperation, respect for other species, for our planet and its boundaries. The pandemic is a human tragedy, but it can also be an opportunity. The past months have shown the huge transformations that were possible when there is political will and consensus on the way forward. Our blueprint already exists: the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, including the Sustainable Development Goals, or the need to set a course for a healthier post-COVID world. These agreements have been adopted by all countries and were inspired by the activism of communities, civil society, and particularly young people across the globe. We now need increased ambition and action to deliver, beginning with the climate emergency. And the central objective of the United Nations this year is to build a global coalition for carbon neutrality by the middle of the century. We need meaningful cuts now to reduce global emissions by 45% by 2030 compared with 2010 levels. And the United Kingdom has already pledged to cut emissions by 68% by 2030 compared with 1990. I look for your continued strong leadership as we prepare for COP26 in Glasgow. Every country, city, organization, financial institution, and company needs to adopt plans to reach net zero emissions by 2050 and start executing them now with clear short-term targets. Distinguished guests and dear friends, the United Nations marked our 75th anniversary last year with a global survey. We asked people around the world to share their hopes, fears, and priorities for international action. Over 1.5 million people responded. And people everywhere called for better access to healthcare, education, safe water, and sanitation. They demanded greater international solidarity and support for those in need. And fully 97% called for improved global cooperation to find multilateral solutions to today's global challenges. They expressed their strong support for a reinvigorated United Nations as the platform for that cooperation. 75 years since its founding, the General Assembly remains the global forum where all countries have a voice. Looking ahead, climate change action was the top priority, followed by action to protect human rights, address conflict and corruption, promote sustainable and inclusive growth, and create jobs. And all this shows that while we face unprecedented challenges, there are reasons for optimism. People everywhere understand that today's problems demand new approaches based on common values and principles. Distinguished guests and dear friends, We are at a 1945 moment, but it is not 1945. Today's war is against a microscopic virus. Tomorrow's could be against terrorists in cyberspace. And we are still losing the long battle against climate change. Conflict is no longer a matter of military and economic might alone, just as power is no longer the sole preserve of states. While the need for international cooperation continues, we must expand our idea of what that means. In our interconnected world, we need a networked multilateralism so that global and regional organizations communicate and work together towards common goals. And we need an inclusive multilateralism based on the equal representation of women and taking in young people, civil society, business and technology, cities and regions, science and academia. We must transform our global system into a global partnership. Justice and equality, including gender equality, are prerequisites. Women's leadership and equal participation are key ways to address the global challenges we face. The past year has highlighted the effectiveness of women's leadership, adding to evidence that gender-balanced decision-making leads to stronger climate agreements, greater investment in social protection, longer-lasting peace, and more innovation. Achieving women's equal representation requires bold action, and I'm proud of our success in this area over the past 4 years. Distinguished guests and dear friends, outside the Houses of Parliament stands a statue of the British suffragist Millicent Fawcett, inscribed with a famous rallying cry, "Courage calls to courage everywhere." Today, it is often young people who are showing courage and demanding courage from the rest of us. Let me be clear, I stand with you. You give me hope. Young people can and do change the world. Your courage, commitment, and action have already made a difference. Today, I see a growing momentum for change from grassroots activists, young people, and civil society, and from businesses, cities, regions, and governments in the United Nations General Assembly. Together, I am confident that we can emerge from COVID-19 and lay the foundations for a cleaner, safer, fairer world for all and for generations to come. Thank you, and I'm at your disposal for a discussion.
Thank you. That was a very powerful speech. You spoke about the survey the UN ran, which was also introduced in the film, and it was very clear that people wanted to see action on climate change, on human rights, on job creation, amongst other things. What will the United Nations do to help deliver that action?
Well, there are things the United Nations can do that are binding. We have international treaties, we have international conventions in relation to many of the aspects that you've mentioned. But on top of that, we have the possibility to advocate. We have a moral authority to ask people to do the right thing. And we have the capacity to convene. We had last year a climate summit that we convened to make sure that we would be able to overcome the present situation in which we are far from guaranteeing that we will be able to survive climate change. And that has triggered a massive response. And that has led to this global coalition that is emerging and developing of more and more countries committing to net zero emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050. And the same convening power in relation to financing for development in the aftermath of COVID, in which we gathered countries to make sure that resources are not only available for the developed world, but are also available for the developing countries. And this convening power in relation to digital technologies, we brought together governments, the business community, scientists, in order to find a multi-stakeholder approach to make sure that digital technology are a good for all and not a risk for our societies. So the combination of binding instruments like international laws and conventions, the combination of our advocacy and our convening power are instruments that we put at the service of the international community to make sure that we emerge from the COVID together and to make sure that we fight climate change and to make sure that we promote human rights everywhere.
Thank you very much. We now want to hear from some of you who are working on these issues every day, and it's my pleasure to first of all introduce Akosa, who is a youth representative from Ghana. She has a question to ask you, Secretary General.
My name is Akosa Japan and I'm a youth activist. Now, climate change is an issue that affects all young people everywhere and impacts all areas of life and work, be it in gender or in health. And so my question is, how can we apply lessons derived from the current international response to COVID-19 in addressing climate change so that we can achieve the Paris Agreement and the SDGs, both of which were agreed 5 years ago?
Some great points made by ACOSA, Secretary General.
When one looks at what's happening today in the world, we are spending trillions of US dollars or of pounds or of euros. We are spending them in supporting the economies and supporting the economies facing the dramatic impacts of COVID-19 in relation to jobs, in relation to inequality, in relation to many other aspects that undermine our economies and our societies. Now, when spending those trillions, we are borrowing in relation to the future. And we need to make sure that those trillions are spent to address at the same time the recovery from the COVID, but also the challenge of climate change. We can use the same money to build coal power plants or to build renewable energy. We can use the same money to support industries that pollute, or to use the same money to create new jobs in the green economy. We can tax people and income, or we tax carbon and pollution. There are many ways in which we can organize our recovery to make it sustainable and inclusive, reducing at the same time inequalities and making peace with nature and with our planet in order to make sure that we are able to tame climate change, and in order to make sure that we will not let temperatures rise more than 1.5 degrees at the end of the century, and that we can get a net zero coalition in the middle of the century to make sure that we rescue our planet.
Thanks for answering ACOSA's question. The UN has existed for 75 years, and before this event I read a list of some of its big achievements, some of which are pretty mind-blowing, like providing food and assistance to people in 88 countries, supplying vaccines to 50% of the world's children, assisting over 80 million people, I should say, fleeing war, famine and persecution. Now, that last one is still a huge challenge, and I'd like to go now to Josie Norton, whose tireless work with her organisation Choose Love has directly changed the lives of displaced children and adults all over the world since it started in 2015. Josie.
Hi, I'm Josie Norton and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Choose Love. We work supporting displaced communities in Europe, the Middle East and the US-Mexican border. Secretary General, you called for a global ceasefire last year. 1% of the world's population have had to flee their homes because of conflict and persecution. Choose Love sees the devastating effects of this every single day in our work. The need for a global ceasefire is more critical than ever, and it's really important for advancing Goal 16, peace and justice. I wondered what progress has been made and if you think a global ceasefire really could be a reality.
Could it be a reality, Secretary General?
Well, we are making progress in several situations. If you see in Syria, a ceasefire is more or less holding, even if the situation is far from being perfect. On the contrary, and we are still going very slowly in a political solution. We have now a ceasefire in Libya. We managed to have a peace agreement in Sudan, and the ceasefire in South Sudan has been irregularly holding. So, I mean, we made some progress, but the truth is that in many other areas, conflicts are still raging. Look at Yemen, where we see this dramatic humanitarian disaster that is fueled by conflict, but also by climate change, by COVID, and by many other aspects. Now, the truth is that there are two main difficulties in our way to peace and to ceasefires across the world. One is the lack of trust. The lack of trust has been an impediment to make people come together and make agreements and stop the conflict. And the second is the number of spoilers. Now, most of the conflicts we have are internal to a country, but we have lots of other countries getting involved and complicating things. Look at Libya. The spoilers are making it much more difficult to move forward after the ceasefire into a political solution. And we need to make sure that we are able to put an end to this kind of interference of countries that undermine the possibility of those that are in conflict in one country to come together. And this is why it is so important, the unity of the Security Council. And this is why it is so important that the biggest powers are able to overcome their differences that exist, but to be able to work together to put some order in the international situation, to make sure that there is no impunity as we see today, to make sure that people in those spoilers understand that they need to stop undermining the possibilities of peace. We need a strong Security Council able to take decisions and to implement them to make sure that the ceasefires that are declared are implemented and those that have not yet been possible become possible.
So, a lot has changed since the founding of the UN and the agreement more recently of the Sustainable Development Goals. One of those is, of course, the role of technology, which has positives and negatives. Let's go now to Maria, who is a campaigner from Colombia, who has a question on this very topic.
Hi, my name is Maria Sierra and I'm a Chibunin alumni from Colombia. And my question is, how might we ensure online spaces are better equipped to empower female leaders and keep them safe from violence?
How do we keep female leaders safe from violence, safe online?
When one looks at the new technologies, and especially the digital technologies, we see that there is enormous potential, and at the same time, there are big risks. First of all, we need to fight for justice. And a key aspect is to make sure that the half of the population that is not linked to the internet gets linked. And one of our objectives in the Sustainable Development Goals is exactly to reach in 2030 access to internet by everybody, everywhere. But on the other hand, we have brought together companies, governments, scientists, and we have now a roadmap for digital cooperation with the objective to avoid the risks created by these new technologies. For instance, hate speech. Hate speech is being fooled by social media. It's absolutely essential to create protocols that allow for respecting the freedom of expression, that allow for hate speech that is an incentive to violence not to be possible. At the same time, we are seeing cybersecurity being undermined. We are seeing people using the internet to put at risk the security of countries, of companies, of people, the human rights of people. We are seeing forms of control of the human rights of people. So we need to establish the norms, the rules, the protocols, either through international conventions or more practically through forms of international cooperation between the different stakeholders, defining red lines, defining best practices in order to make sure that those technologies become a force for good and they are not used to undermine the cohesion of all societies.
And finally, health, obviously a huge issue right now. So I'd like to go to you, Brad, to ask your question on this crucial topic. Brad.
Hello, my name is Brad. I'm a youth advisor for the NHS and I'm extremely passionate about young people being heard on matters relating to them. As a cancer survivor, I really relate to SDG 3, promoting good health and well-being for everyone, everywhere. What's the Secretary-General's assessment of the likelihood of achieving universal health coverage by 2030, given that we're still responding to the COVID-19 pandemic? And what more do countries and the world need to do in order to achieve this? Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. Secretary-General.
Well, one of the fathers of the European Union that has always inspired me is called Jean Monnet. And once he was asked if he was optimistic or pessimistic about one issue, like you have asked me about whether I think it's possible or not to have universal health coverage in 2030. And his answer was, I'm not optimistic, I'm not pessimistic, I'm determined. And here I can tell you, I am determined to do everything I can to mobilize the international community for universal health coverage to be a reality in 2030. And we must all do the same. It is impossible not to feel, I would say, our heart broken when we see so many people, especially in these times of COVID, but not only COVID, with all kinds of diseases, so many people that have no access to health care. This is absolutely intolerable. And a key priority for each government, each country, but for the international community as a whole, is to guarantee that the right for health coverage is a right that everybody can enjoy. And for that, we need to mobilize international resources. We need to mobilize international solidarity. But we need also to ask governments to fight corruption, to adopt good governance measures, to use the proper fiscal measures, to define correctly their budgets, and to give priority to health coverage. And within health coverage, not to forget mental health. One of the things that breaks my heart is to see at the present moment with the COVID, how much mental health is a threat to so many people around the world, and how little we are doing to support people in these circumstances. Mental health has been the forgotten aspect of universal health coverage. It is absolutely essential without any stigmatization, because this is something that can happen to everybody, everywhere in different ways, to make sure that mental health is one of the priorities of our action, and that universal health coverage is a reality for all, and a reality that includes all aspects of health well-being, including mental health.
Thank you. These have been such insightful questions, and yet another reminder of the power of young people. Now, my final question to you, Secretary General, is some people, especially young people, may not feel that the UN is relevant to them. What would you say to them about why the United Nations still matters today?
Well, I do believe when one sees climate change, of course, is a matter of interest for me. I'm 71 years old, but it's essentially a matter of interest for my children and my grandchildren. And climate change is a priority in the action of the United Nations. When we see the Sustainable Development Goals, the role of education, the question of jobs, all these are main concerns of young people, and all these are central in the action of the United Nations. So it is clear for me that what the United Nations does is relevant for young people. And the survey we made demonstrates that young people is more cosmopolitan, more open-minded, more able to understand that without international cooperation, without multilateralism, without the United Nations, it will be very difficult to face the challenges of today. But we need, in the United Nations, as we need in governments all over the world, and international organizations all over the world, we need to give a voice to young people. I mean, in the past, young people tended to be ignored. Then at a certain moment, political leaders understood that they had to talk to young people. But the problem is we need to listen more to young people and to give young people the instruments of intervention in societies for their voice to be heard and for their opinions to be taken into account in the way policies are defined and decisions are taken. There is here a question of power. It's essential if we want to have a better world to create the institutional mechanisms to empower young people at national level and at global level.
Thank you, Secretary General, for such a thought-provoking discussion. And thank you, Sir Josie, Maria and Brad, for your important questions. And to play us out, I'm going to hand us over to activist and campaigner Bethel Tadise to introduce a brand new short film. And if after this, we hope you do, you feel compelled to take action afterwards, please visit un75.online/take-action. Continue this conversation with your networks using the hashtag UN75, and please do share this film. From me, Tina Dahealy, thank you so much for tuning into this significant virtual event, We the People. And to conclude, please welcome Bethel.
Hi, I'm Bethel. I'm an activist working on gender equality and also campaigner on the global goals. When I first started as an activist, to be honest, I didn't know much about the global goals. But through my campaigning, I've come to see how they can help drive action. For me, the power of the goals is that they provide a common plan, which shows how all issues we're fighting for, whether it's women's rights, protecting our planet, or fighting for racial justice, are interconnected. Our leaders all signed up to these goals 5 years ago. So they are a tool to make sure that they keep these promises. Last year showed more than ever the importance of both working together and accountability. So, as we move into 2021, I'm really pleased to close this event with a new film made by our team at Project Everyone on why the global goals are still the answer.